Sarah Martinez stepped out of her rusty pickup truck, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the worn leather gun case in the back. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside County shooting range, and she could already hear the low murmur of conversation from the group of seasoned competitors gathered near the registration table. At 23, Sarah worked double shifts at a local diner to make ends meet. Her faded jeans had patches on the knees, her boots were scuffed beyond repair, and her father's old hunting jacket hung loose on her small frame. She clutched the gun case tighter, knowing what lay inside would only invite more scrutiny. The annual precision shooting competition drew marksmen from across 3 states. Prize money of $15,000 had attracted seasoned hunters, military veterans, and competitive shooters who traveled with custom rifles worth more than Sarah's monthly rent. She had scraped together the $50 entry fee from tip money, hoping against hope that today might change everything. As she approached the registration desk, conversations gradually died down. Marcus Webb, a burly man in his 40s with military tattoos covering his forearms, looked her up and down with obvious amusement. He had won this competition twice before with his state-of-the-art precision rifle and hand-loaded ammunition. Well, what do we have here?" Marcus announced loudly, causing other competitors to turn and stare. "Looks like we got ourselves a little lost lamb." Sarah's cheeks burned red, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm here to register for the competition." The registration official, an elderly man named Tom who had been running these events for over a decade, looked surprised. "Miss, this is a precision shooting competition. The targets are set at distances up to 800 yards. Most of these gentlemen have been shooting competitively for years." "I understand," Sarah replied quietly, sliding her entry fee across the table. Behind her, she could hear whispered comments and barely contained laughter. Someone mentioned something about participation trophies and wasting everyone's time. Another voice suggested she would be better off at the county fair, shooting balloons with a BB gun. When Sarah unzipped her gun case, the laughter became more open. Inside lay a Remington 700 from 1987, its blue steel finish worn to gray in places. The wooden stock had multiple dings and scratches, and the scope looked like it had seen better decades. Compared to the high-tech rifles being assembled around her, complete with custom barrels, adjustable stocks, and scopes that cost more than her truck, Sarah's rifle looked like a museum piece. "Is that thing even safe to fire?" asked Jennifer Chen, one of only 2 other women in the competition, though her designer shooting gear and expensive equipment suggested she came from very different circumstances than Sarah. Marcus walked over and examined Sarah's rifle with theatrical concern. "Honey, that old thing belongs in a gun buyback program, not a serious competition. You're going to embarrass yourself out there." The other competitors gathered around, and Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention. Someone pointed out that her ammunition was basic factory loads rather than precision hand-loaded rounds. Another competitor noticed that her shooting mat was actually an old camping sleeping pad with duct tape repairs. "Look at those hands shake," whispered a young man named David, who had driven up from Arizona with a truck full of shooting equipment. "She's already nervous and we haven't even started." Sarah's hands were indeed trembling, but not entirely from nerves. The morning was cold and she had been too anxious to eat breakfast. More importantly, holding her father's rifle always brought back a flood of emotions she struggled to control. Tom, the registration official, felt sorry for her. "Miss, there's no shame in waiting until you're better prepared. This competition can be pretty intense for newcomers." "I'm not a newcomer to shooting," Sarah said softly, though her voice was barely audible over the growing murmur of the crowd. "Shooting squirrels in your backyard doesn't count as experience." "Sweetheart," Marcus called out, earning chuckles from several other competitors. As Sarah filled out her registration paperwork, she noticed her hands were shaking more visibly now. The stress of being the center of mockery was getting to her, and she could feel tears threatening to form. She had hoped to honor her father's memory by competing, but instead she was being treated like a sideshow attraction. The competition format was explained to all participants. 3 rounds of shooting at increasing distances, 300 yards, 500 yards, and finally 800 yards. Each round consisted of 10 shots with points awarded based on accuracy. The shooter with the highest combined score would win the prize money. At 800 yards, you can barely see the target without high-powered optics. Jennifer Chen commented to the group, "That old scope won't even focus properly at that distance." Sarah examined her father's scope more carefully. It was indeed an older model, and she had to admit it had seen better days. The adjustment knobs were worn smooth, and there was a small crack in the objective lens that she had never noticed before. More competitors arrived, and each new arrival seemed to bring more sophisticated equipment. There were rifles with carbon fiber barrels, advanced ballistic computers, and shooting rests that looked like precision engineering marvels. Several competitors had support crews helping them set up elaborate shooting positions. By the time the safety briefing began, Sarah realized she was completely outmatched in terms of equipment. Her father's old rifle, which had seemed so important and powerful in her memories, now looked pathetic compared to the modern precision instruments surrounding her. The range safety officer, a retired Marine named Frank, went through the standard safety procedures and competition rules. As he spoke, Sarah noticed several competitors continuing to glance in her direction and whisper among themselves. She was clearly the topic of ongoing conversation and amusement. "First relay begins in 30 minutes, Frank announced. "Take time to set up your shooting positions and zero your rifles if needed." Sarah found herself assigned to firing position 12, right in the middle of the line. As she unpacked her minimal gear, she couldn't help but notice the elaborate setups on either side of her. Marcus had positioned himself to her left and was assembling what looked like a mobile precision shooting laboratory. "You sure you want to go through with this?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested concern rather than mockery. "It's going to be embarrassing when you can't even hit the target frame at 300 yards. Sarah nodded silently and began setting up her father's old rifle on the worn shooting mat. As she worked, more memories flooded back of the man who had taught her everything she knew about shooting. The pain of his loss, still fresh after 2 years, mixed with determination to prove that his teachings had not been wasted on her. The other competitors finished their setups and began practice shots to zero their scopes. The sound of precision rifles echoing across the range was intimidating, and Sarah realized she was about to find out whether her father's lessons had prepared her for this moment, or if she was about to become the laughingstock of the entire shooting community. As Sarah lay behind her father's rifle, adjusting the worn bipod legs on the concrete shooting bench, her mind drifted back to a different time. She was 8 years old again, standing in the backyard of their small house on the outskirts of town, watching her father clean this very same rifle with the patience and precision of a master craftsman. Roberto Martinez had been a legend in military shooting circles, though he rarely spoke about his achievements. His service record included 3 tours as a designated marksman, where his ability to place precise shots at extreme distances had saved countless lives. The Distinguished Service Cross hanging in their hallway was just one of many decorations he had earned. But he had always been more interested in teaching his daughter than reliving past glory. "Mija," he would say in his gentle voice, using the Spanish term of endearment that always made her feel special. "Shooting is not about the rifle. The rifle is just a tool. Shooting is about breathing, patience, and understanding the world around you." Sarah remembered those early lessons clearly. Her father would set up tin cans on fence posts at 50 yards and teach her to shoot with a .22 rifle that was almost as tall as she was. While other children her age were playing video games or watching television, Sarah was learning to read wind patterns by watching grass bend and feeling air currents on her face. "See how the leaves move on that oak tree?" her father would point out. "The wind is coming from the southwest at about 5 miles per hour. At this distance, it won't affect your shot much, but always be aware. Always be thinking." Those weekend shooting sessions had been the highlight of Sarah's childhood. Her father worked long hours at the factory during the week, often coming home exhausted and covered in grease. But Saturday mornings belonged to them and the rifle range he had built in the hills behind their house. As Sarah got older, the lessons became more sophisticated. Roberto taught her about ballistics, how bullets dropped over distance and how atmospheric conditions affected flight paths. He showed her how to calculate adjustments for different altitudes and temperatures, using mathematical formulas that most competitive shooters learned from expensive courses or coaching. "The military taught me to shoot, but Mexico taught me to think," Roberto would explain, referencing his childhood in a small village where hunting was necessary for survival. "In the army, they gave me perfect ammunition and perfect conditions, but real shooting happens in the real world, where nothing is perfect." By the time Sarah was 16, she could consistently hit targets at 600 yards with her father's old rifle. Roberto had started entering her in local competitions, where she often surprised older, more experienced shooters with her natural ability and deep understanding of shooting fundamentals. But then came the diagnosis. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the range officer's voice calling for the first relay to begin. She forced herself to focus on the present, though the memories of her father's illness still brought a sharp pain to her chest. The lung cancer had moved quickly, and within 6 months, the man who had taught her everything about precision and patience was gone. Looking through her father's scope now, Sarah could see the 300-yard target clearly. The black bullseye looked small but manageable, similar to targets she had practiced on countless times. What the other competitors didn't know was that this rifle had been her father's primary competition gun during his own shooting career, before marriage and fatherhood had shifted his priorities to teaching rather than competing. The Remington 700 might have looked worn and outdated, but Roberto Martinez had spent years perfecting every aspect of its performance. The trigger had been professionally adjusted to break cleanly at exactly 2.5 pounds. The barrel had been carefully bedded to ensure consistent accuracy. Even the old scope, despite its scratched exterior, had been precision-mounted and had held its 0 through thousands of rounds. Relay 1, prepare to fire, announced Frank, the range safety officer. Sarah settled into her shooting position, remembering her father's voice. The rifle becomes part of your body. Your heartbeat, your breathing, your muscle tension, everything must work together. She could hear Marcus chuckling to her left as he made final adjustments to his high-tech scope. This should be entertaining, he muttered to David, who was shooting from the position on his other side. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and visualized the shooting sequence her father had taught her. Control breathing, natural point of aim, smooth trigger press, follow through. These fundamentals had been drilled into her through thousands of practice sessions, until they were as natural as walking. The morning air was still, with just a slight breeze from the east. Sarah noted the wind direction automatically, adjusting her hold slightly to compensate for the minimal drift it would cause. These calculations happened instinctively now, learned through years of practice in varying conditions. Commence fire, Frank called out. The line erupted with the sharp cracks of precision rifles. Sarah waited for the initial chaos to settle, then took her first shot. The familiar recoil of her father's rifle felt like coming home. Through the scope, she could see her bullet had struck just left of center, exactly where she had aimed to account for the light crosswind. Around her, other shooters were having varying degrees of success. She could hear frustrated muttering from some positions and confident commentary from others. Marcus seemed pleased with his shooting, occasionally glancing over to see how the amateur was performing. Sarah continued methodically through her 10-round string. Each shot felt natural and controlled, exactly as her father had taught her. She made minor adjustments based on wind changes and her reading of the rifle's behavior, small corrections that came from deep familiarity with the weapon. When the ceasefire was called, shooters began walking down range to examine their targets. Sarah felt nervous butterflies in her stomach as she followed the group toward the target line. This would be the first real test of whether her father's training could compete with modern equipment and formal coaching. Marcus reached his target first and let out a satisfied grunt. His group was tight with 8 of 10 shots in the high-scoring inner rings. It was impressive shooting that demonstrated both skill and quality equipment. Other competitors were checking their targets with varying degrees of satisfaction. Jennifer Chen looked pleased with her performance, while David seemed frustrated with a couple of shots that had strayed outside the scoring rings. When Sarah reached target 12, she had to look twice to believe what she was seeing. 10 holes were clustered tightly in the center of the bullseye, with 9 shots forming a group smaller than a silver dollar, and 1 shot just slightly outside that cluster. "Holy shit," whispered the competitor from position 11, who had wandered over to look. "Is that your target?" Sarah nodded, still staring at the evidence of her shooting. It was better than she had hoped and exactly what her father would have expected. Roberto had always taught her to shoot for perfection, settling for nothing less than her absolute best effort. Word began spreading quickly along the target line. Competitors who had been dismissing Sarah as a curiosity were now taking closer looks at her target. The tight group at 300 yards was the kind of shooting that won competitions, and it had come from the woman they had been mocking just an hour earlier. Marcus walked over to examine Sarah's target more closely, his expression shifting from amusement to something approaching concern. "Lucky group," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. 300 yards is the easy part. Let's see how you do when the distances get real." But as they walked back to the firing line for the second relay at 500 yards, Sarah noticed the conversations around her had changed. The open laughter and dismissive comments had been replaced by curious glances and speculative whispers. The woman with the shaky hands and the old rifle had just shot better than most of the experienced competitors on the line. The atmosphere on the shooting line had shifted subtly as competitors prepared for the 500-yard stage. Sarah noticed the difference immediately. Fewer dismissive glances, more careful observation of her equipment and technique. She overheard Jennifer Chen asking another shooter about the specifications of older Remington 700 models. While David was openly staring at her rifle setup with newfound interest, Marcus, however, seemed determined to maintain his original assessment. "One good group doesn't make a shooter," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. 500 yards separates the pretenders from the real marksmen. That's where equipment starts to matter. Sarah ignored the comment and focused on preparing for the longer shot. Her father had always emphasized that each distance required mental recalibration. At 500 yards, factors that were negligible at 300 became critically important. Wind drift increased exponentially, bullet drop required precise compensation, and any flaws in shooting technique became magnified. She examined the range carefully, noting how the morning sun was beginning to create heat mirages that would affect her sight picture. Roberto had taught her to read these atmospheric conditions like a book. Understanding how temperature gradients and air density changes could deflect a bullet's path by inches at extended ranges. The wind had picked up slightly, now coming from the southeast at approximately 8 miles per hour with occasional gusts. Sarah could see tall grass near the target line bending in waves, indicating the wind was somewhat variable. This was exactly the kind of challenging condition her father had prepared her for during their weekend practice sessions. "Mija, anyone can shoot in perfect conditions," Roberto had often said. "But a true marksman learns to read the environment and adapt. The wind is not your enemy, it's information." Sarah made her adjustment calculations mentally, adding 2 clicks of right windage to her scope to compensate for the crosswind. The mathematical formulas her father had taught her were simpler than the ballistic computer programs some competitors used, but they were based on decades of practical experience and had never failed her. As she settled into her shooting position, Sarah became aware that she was being watched more intently than before. Several competitors had positioned themselves where they could observe her technique, clearly trying to understand how someone with such basic equipment had achieved such impressive results. Frank called the line to order. 500 yards, 10 rounds for record. Take your time and make your shots count. Sarah controlled her breathing and found her natural point of aim. Through her father's old scope, the target looked significantly smaller than at 300 yards. The bullseye that had seemed manageable before now appeared as a small black circle that demanded absolute precision. The first shot broke cleanly, and Sarah saw her bullet impact just right of center in the bullseye. She made a small adjustment and fired again, this time hitting exactly where she was aiming. The familiar rhythm of precision shooting took over. Breathe, aim, press, follow through, repeat. Around her, the sounds of the competition continued. She could hear Marcus firing at a steady pace, confident in his equipment and ability. Jennifer was taking longer between shots, clearly being more methodical at the increased distance. David seemed to be struggling with longer pauses between his shots, suggesting he was having difficulty with the conditions. By her 6th shot, Sarah realized she was shooting better than she had hoped. Each bullet was going exactly where she intended, and her confidence was building with every round. The old rifle felt perfectly familiar in her hands, responding to her inputs like a precision instrument despite its worn appearance. The wind shifted slightly during her 8th shot, and Sarah compensated instinctively, adjusting her hold point based on the movement of grass and the feel of air current on her face. These were the subtle skills Roberto had spent years teaching her, lessons that couldn't be learned from books or videos, but required extensive practice in varying conditions. When the ceasefire was called, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about her performance. The shots had felt good, with clean trigger breaks and consistent follow-through. But 500 yards was unforgiving. and even small mistakes could result in shots outside the scoring rings. The walk to the target seemed longer this time, with more competitors clustering around to see the results. Sarah noticed that the joking and casual conversation had been replaced by more serious discussion about wind conditions and shooting techniques. Marcus reached his target first and examined it carefully before announcing, "Not bad for the conditions. 8 in the 10 ring, 2 in the 9. It was solid shooting that demonstrated his experience and quality equipment. Several other competitors achieved similar results, with most managing to keep the majority of their shots in the high-scoring rings, despite the challenging wind. Jennifer Chen seemed pleased with her target, showing a consistent group with 7 shots in the 10 ring. The wind was tricky, she commented to nearby competitors, but manageable if you read it carefully. When Sarah reached her target, a small crowd had already gathered. What they saw caused several sharp intakes of breath and one audible curse from David. 10 shots were clustered tightly in the center of the bullseye, with 9 shots forming a group smaller than a quarter, and 1 shot just touching the edge of that cluster. "Jesus Christ," muttered the competitor from position 13. "How is she doing this with that old equipment?" Sarah stared at her target in amazement. It was better than her best practice sessions with her father, and significantly better than she had expected under competition pressure. The tight group represented shooting that would challenge even the most experienced competitors. Marcus pushed through the small crowd to examine Sarah's target more closely. His confident demeanor was beginning to show cracks as he studied the precise shot placement. "Lucky wind calls," he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. "That's not luck," said Tom, the elderly range officer who had been running competitions for decades. "That's some of the finest precision shooting I've seen at this range." "Miss, where did you learn to shoot like that?" "My father taught me," Sarah replied quietly, still somewhat overwhelmed by her performance. As they walked back toward the firing line, conversations around Sarah had changed completely. Competitors who had been dismissive were now asking questions about her training and background. Several wanted to examine her rifle more closely, curious about how such an apparently basic setup could produce such outstanding results. David approached her directly. "I have to ask, what's your background? Military training? Professional coaching?" "Just my father," Sarah repeated. "He taught me everything I know about shooting." "Your father must have been one hell of a marksman," Tom commented. "Teaching someone to shoot groups like that takes serious skill and knowledge." Sarah felt a mix of pride and sadness at the comment. Roberto would have been proud of her performance, but she wished desperately that he could have been there to see it. These targets represented years of his patient instruction and encouragement, lessons that were now paying off in ways she had never imagined possible. As they prepared for the final stage at 800 yards, Sarah realized the dynamic had completely changed. No one was laughing at her equipment anymore, and the shaky-handed amateur had transformed in their eyes into a serious competitor who might actually have a chance of winning the entire competition. Marcus was no longer making dismissive comments, instead focusing intently on his own equipment and preparation. The casual confidence he had displayed earlier was being replaced by the focused intensity of someone who realized he might have real competition from an unexpected source. Sarah felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. The final stage would determine the winner, and 800 yards was a distance where even the smallest mistake could cost the competition. Everything her father had taught her would be put to the ultimate test. 800 yards stretched before them like an eternity. The target, visible through high-powered spotting scopes, appeared as a tiny speck against the earthen backstop. At this distance, the bullseye was smaller than a dinner plate, and hitting it consistently required a combination of perfect technique, superior equipment, and favorable conditions. Sarah peered through her father's scope, straining to see the target clearly. The magnification, which had been adequate at shorter ranges, was now being pushed to its limits. She could make out the general shape of the target, but the precise aiming point that had been so clear at 300 and 500 yards was now challenging to define. Around her, competitors were making extensive preparations. Marcus had deployed a sophisticated wind meter and was consulting a ballistic computer program on his phone. Jennifer was using a high-powered spotting scope to study the target and wind conditions downrange. Several shooters had brought portable weather stations to monitor temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. Sarah's preparation looked primitive by comparison. She had only her father's teachings and her own observations of the natural environment. But Roberto had always insisted that the most important instruments were her eyes, her instincts, and her understanding of how bullets behaved in real-world conditions. At 800 yards, that old scope is going to be a serious handicap, David commented, though his tone was now respectful rather than dismissive. You can barely see the target clearly enough to aim precisely. Sarah had to admit he was right. The scope's magnification and optical clarity, which had seemed perfectly adequate during practice sessions with her father, were being severely tested by the extreme distance. She could see the target, but picking out precise aiming points was difficult. The wind had become more complex as the day warmed. Sarah could see multiple indicators across the range, flags hanging at different angles, grass bending in varying directions, and heat mirages creating visual distortion. Reading these conditions accurately would be crucial, as wind drift at 800 yards could move a bullet several inches even in relatively calm conditions. Roberto had spent countless hours teaching her to read these signs. The wind near you is not the wind near the target, he had explained. You must read the entire path of the bullet, from muzzle to impact. Look for changes in vegetation, watch for dust patterns, feel the air currents on your skin. Sarah studied the range carefully, noting how the wind seemed stronger in the middle section where there was less natural windbreak from trees and hills. The flags at different distances were telling a story of variable conditions that would require careful interpretation. Frank began the final safety briefing for the 800-yard stage. This is precision shooting at its most demanding, he announced to the gathered competitors. Take your time, read the conditions carefully, and remember that safety is our first priority. As Sarah prepared her shooting position, she noticed that all pretense of casual competition had disappeared. Every shooter was now focused intently on their preparation, understanding that this stage would determine the winner. The prize money was significant, but more importantly, bragging rights at this level of competition were something special. Marcus had claimed the shooting position to Sarah's left, and she could see him making elaborate calculations and adjustments to his equipment. His rifle setup looked like something from a science fiction movie. With a scope that cost more than Sarah's annual grocery budget and accessories that seemed designed for moonshots rather than terrestrial targets. First relay. Prepare to fire, Frank called out. Sarah settled behind her father's rifle and tried to find the most comfortable shooting position possible. At this distance, even small variations in body position could affect accuracy. She adjusted her shooting mat, repositioned her bipod, and worked to find that perfect natural point of aim her father had taught her to seek. Through the scope, the target looked impossibly small. The black bullseye that had seemed manageable at 500 yards now appeared as a tiny dot that seemed to dance in the heat waves rising from the ground. Sarah had to blink several times and concentrate hard just to maintain a clear sight picture. The mathematical calculations required for 800 yards were complex. Bullet drop at this distance was measured in feet rather than inches, requiring significant elevation adjustment. Wind drift became exponential, with even a 5-mile-per-hour crosswind capable of moving a bullet several inches off target. Sarah made her adjustments based on the formulas her father had taught her, combined with her reading of the current conditions. She added 12 clicks of elevation to account for bullet drop and 3 clicks of right windage for the crosswind she was observing. Commence fire, Frank announced. The line erupted with the sounds of precision rifles, but Sarah waited. Her father had taught her patience, the ability to wait for the right moment rather than rushing into shots. She watched the wind indicators for several seconds, looking for a pattern in the constantly changing conditions. When she felt confident in her read of the wind, Sarah took her first shot. The recoil felt familiar and comforting, but at 800 yards it would be several seconds before she could see the bullet impact. Through her scope, she watched for the tiny puff of dust that would indicate where her bullet had struck. The impact was visible just left of center in the bullseye. Sarah smiled slightly, exactly where she had aimed to account for a slight wind change she had observed just before firing. Her father's training was holding up even under the most demanding conditions. Around her, other competitors were having varying degrees of success. She could hear Marcus muttering calculations between shots, clearly working hard to maintain his accuracy at the extreme distance. Jennifer seemed to be taking longer between shots, using her spotting scope to carefully analyze each impact before firing again. Sarah continued methodically through her string of shots. Each one required careful reading of wind conditions, precise aiming, and smooth trigger control. The old rifle was performing flawlessly, delivering the same consistent accuracy it had provided during countless practice sessions with Roberto. By her 7th shot, Sarah realized she was shooting exceptionally well. The impacts were clustering tightly in the center of the target, forming a group that would be impressive at any distance, but was remarkable at 800 yards with basic equipment. The wind shifted noticeably during her 8th shot, and Sarah made an instinctive adjustment to her hold point. These were the moments her father had prepared her for, when conditions changed rapidly and there was no time for elaborate calculations or computer consultations. Only experience and instinct could guide the shot. When she fired her final 2 shots, Sarah felt confident she had given her absolute best effort. Every shot had been carefully planned and executed with clean trigger breaks and consistent follow-through. Whether it would be enough to win the competition remained to be seen, but she knew her father would have been proud of her performance. "Cease fire," Frank called out, ending the final stage of the competition. As competitors began walking toward the distant targets, Sarah felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The 800-yard walk would determine whether her father's training had been sufficient to overcome the equipment disadvantage she faced. Marcus seemed confident as they walked, discussing his shots with David and analyzing the wind conditions they had encountered. Jennifer looked satisfied with her performance, though she mentioned that the distance had been challenging even with her expensive optics. Sarah walked quietly, thinking about Roberto and how proud he would have been to see her compete at this level. Every technique she had used, every wind reading she had made, every adjustment she had calculated came directly from his patient instruction during those weekend sessions in the hills behind their house. When they reached the target line, a crowd had already gathered around target number 12. Sarah could hear excited voices and animated discussion, but she couldn't yet see what had captured everyone's attention. As she pushed through the small crowd, Sarah saw her target clearly for the first time. 10 bullet holes were clustered in a group no larger than a silver dollar, all within the highest scoring ring of the bullseye. It was shooting that would have been impressive at any distance, but at 800 yards with basic equipment, it was extraordinary. The silence around Sarah's target was deafening. Seasoned competitors who had been shooting for decades stood staring at the tight cluster of bullet holes with expressions of disbelief and grudging admiration. Tom, the range officer, was examining the target with a magnifying glass, counting impact points and measuring group sizes with scientific precision. 10 shots, all in the X-ring, Tom announced officially. Group size approximately 2 3/4 inches at 800 yards. He looked up at Sarah with something approaching awe. "Miss, in 30 years of running competitions, I've seen maybe 5 groups this good at this distance." Marcus pushed forward to examine the target himself. His confident demeanor completely evaporated. His own shooting had been respectable, 8 shots in the 10 ring with 2 straying into the 9 ring, but it looked amateurish compared to Sarah's precision. The expensive equipment and years of experience had been outperformed by a young woman with a rifle older than she was. "There's no way," Marcus muttered, though his protest lacked conviction. "Not with that equipment. Not at this distance." Jennifer Chen stepped closer to study Sarah's target, shaking her head in amazement. "I've been shooting competitively for 8 years and I've never seen anything like this. How did you compensate for the wind changes with basic optics?" Sarah felt overwhelmed by the attention and questions. She had expected to perform well. Her father had prepared her thoroughly, but even she was surprised by the level of precision she had achieved under competition pressure. The tight group represented shooting that exceeded her best practice sessions. "Miss Martinez," Tom continued, consulting his scoring sheets, "unless I'm making a serious mathematical error, you've just won this competition by a significant margin. Your combined score across all 3 distances is the highest I've recorded at this range." The announcement sent a buzz through the gathered crowd. Other competitors began examining their own targets with resignation, realizing they had just witnessed something exceptional. David looked at his target, respectable shooting that would normally place him in the top 5, and laughed with genuine appreciation for what Sarah had accomplished. "I have to know," David said directly to Sarah. "Your father, was he military? Professional instructor? How did he teach you to shoot like that? Before Sarah could answer, Marcus interrupted with obvious frustration. She's obviously had professional training she's not telling us about. Nobody learns to shoot like that from casual instruction. The accusation stung, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger. She had been honest about her background from the beginning, and Marcus's inability to accept her success was becoming insulting to both her and her father's memory. My father was Roberto Martinez, Sarah said quietly, though her voice carried clearly across the group. He served 3 tours as a designated marksman with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Firebase Charlie in Afghanistan. The name brought immediate recognition from several veterans in the crowd. Tom's eyes widened with understanding, and Frank, the range safety officer, stepped forward with obvious interest. Roberto Martinez? Frank asked. Sergeant Roberto Martinez, who held the longest confirmed kill shot for the 3rd Infantry. Sarah nodded, feeling both pride and sadness at the recognition her father's achievements were finally receiving. He never talked much about his military service, but yes, he was recognized for his marksmanship skills. Frank turned to address the gathered competitors with obvious respect. Gentlemen and ladies, Roberto Martinez was a legend in military shooting circles. His record for precision shooting under combat conditions stood for over 5 years. If he trained his daughter, that explains everything we've seen here today. Marcus looked skeptical but was clearly struggling to maintain his doubts in the face of mounting evidence. Military training doesn't automatically transfer to civilian competition, he argued, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. My father didn't train me for competition, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about Roberto. He trained me to understand shooting as a discipline, as a way of thinking about precision and patience. Every weekend from the time I was 8 until he died 2 years ago, we would spend hours at his range in the hills. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, no longer seeing mockery but genuine interest and respect. He taught me that equipment doesn't make a marksman. Understanding does. Reading wind, calculating drop, controlling breathing. These are skills that come from practice and instruction, not from expensive scopes and custom rifles. Tom was nodding thoughtfully as Sarah spoke. Roberto Martinez trained shooters during his military career. Some of the best precision marksmen in the service learned from him. It makes perfect sense that he would pass those skills on to his daughter. But the equipment limitations, Jennifer protested, though not argumentatively. That scope can't possibly have the clarity and magnification needed for precise 800-yard shooting. Sarah smiled for the first time since the competition began. My father used to say that shooters who needed perfect equipment to shoot well didn't really understand shooting. He made me practice with iron sights at 600 yards until I could hit consistently. After that, any scope felt like cheating. Marcus examined Sarah's rifle more closely, running his hands over the worn stock and studying the old scope with newfound interest. Despite his earlier dismissiveness, he was an experienced enough shooter to recognize quality when he saw it, even in aged equipment. The action is smooth, he admitted grudgingly. And the trigger breaks clean. I guess I assumed that old meant inferior. My father spent years perfecting this rifle, Sarah explained. The trigger was professionally adjusted. The barrel was carefully bedded and every component was chosen for accuracy rather than appearance. He always said that a rifle's performance comes from precision in its setup, not from its price tag. Frank was examining the target again with obvious fascination. The wind reading skills required for this kind of precision are extraordinary. Military marksmen spend months learning to read environmental conditions accurately. Every weekend, no matter what the weather. Sarah remembered aloud. Rain, snow, wind, heat. My father insisted we shoot in all conditions. He would set up targets at different distances and make me calculate adjustments for everything from temperature changes to altitude variations. The crowd around Sarah had grown as word spread about the exceptional shooting and the revelation of her background. Other competitors who had finished examining their own targets came to see what the excitement was about. Sergeant Martinez trained some of the finest military marksmen of his generation, added another veteran competitor, who had recognized the name. I served with guys who went through his courses. They all said he was the most demanding instructor they ever encountered, but also the most effective. Sarah felt a deep warmth spreading through her chest as she listened to these men speak about her father with obvious respect and admiration. Roberto had rarely discussed his military career with her, focusing instead on teaching and spending time together. Hearing about his professional reputation from his peers was both enlightening and deeply moving. "He never told me about training other soldiers," Sarah said softly. "He just focused on teaching me to shoot correctly, to understand the fundamentals completely before worrying about advanced techniques." "That sounds like Roberto," Frank said with a slight smile. He believed that perfect fundamentals would carry a shooter further than any amount of advanced equipment or complex techniques. Marcus was still studying Sarah's rifle, clearly trying to reconcile his assumptions about equipment with the evidence of the target. "I've been shooting competitively for 15 years, he said finally. "I've spent thousands of dollars on equipment upgrades, trying to gain every possible advantage. And here you are, out shooting everyone with a rifle from the 1980s. "It's not about the rifle," Sarah repeated her father's words. "It's about understanding the shot. My father made me explain every aspect of each shot I took, why I chose a particular hold point, how I read the wind, what atmospheric conditions I was accounting for. He wouldn't let me fire until I could justify every decision." The mathematical precision required for Sarah's performance was becoming clearer to the other competitors as they understood her background. Military marksmen routinely engaged targets at extreme ranges under challenging conditions, using calculation methods that were both more sophisticated and more practical than civilian competition techniques. "Your father must have been incredibly patient," Jennifer observed. "Teaching that level of precision to a child would require years of consistent instruction." "He was the most patient man I ever knew," Sarah replied, her voice catching slightly with emotion. "Even when I was frustrated or making mistakes, he would just calmly explain things again until I understood. He used to say that anger and impatience were the enemies of accuracy." Tom was completing his final score calculations, double-checking his mathematics to ensure accuracy. The numbers confirmed what everyone had witnessed. Sarah's combined score across all three distances was not just the winning total, but a new range record that exceeded the previous best performance by a significant margin. "Miss Martinez," Tom announced formally, "congratulations on winning the annual Precision Shooting Championship. Your total score of 298 out of a possible 300 points is a new range record." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, coming from competitors who had initially dismissed her, but now understood they had witnessed something truly exceptional. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she accepted the congratulations, wishing desperately that Roberto could have been there to see his training validated in such spectacular fashion. The $15,000 prize money would solve many of Sarah's financial problems, but the real victory was the vindication of her father's teaching methods and the respect she had earned from the shooting community. The drive home from the shooting range felt surreal to Sarah. The leather bank envelope containing $15,000 in prize money sat on the passenger seat of her pickup truck, but her mind was focused on something far more valuable: the respect she had earned and the honor she had brought to her father's memory. During the awards ceremony, Tom had asked Sarah to say a few words to the gathered competitors. Standing at the small podium with her father's worn rifle beside her, she had struggled to find adequate words to express what the day had meant to her. "This victory belongs to my father, Roberto Martinez," she had said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Everything I accomplished today came from his patience, his knowledge, and his dedication to teaching me not just how to shoot, but how to think like a marksman." The applause had been respectful and sustained, coming from people who now understood they had witnessed the culmination of years of disciplined training and natural talent, guided by an expert instructor. Even Marcus had approached her afterward to offer genuine congratulations and ask if she would consider giving him some tips on wind-reading techniques. As Sarah pulled into the driveway of her small rental house, she noticed her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, sitting on her porch as usual, watching the neighborhood with the vigilant attention of someone who had lived on the same street for 40 years. Mrs. Chen waved, and Sarah realized she would need to explain why she looked different, more confident, more settled than when she had left that morning. Inside the house, Sarah carefully placed her father's rifle in its case and set it in the corner where it usually resided. The familiar weight and feel of the weapon had been her connection to Roberto throughout the competition, and returning it to its resting place felt like completing a circle that had begun 2 years earlier with his death. She sat at her small kitchen table and spread out the scorecards from the competition, studying the numbers that documented her exceptional performance. At 300 yards, 100 points out of 100. At 500 yards, 99 points out of 100. At 800 yards, 99 points out of 100. The total of 298 out of 300 possible points represented shooting that most competitors could only dream of achieving. But the numbers didn't capture what had really happened during those hours at the range. Sarah had discovered something about herself that she hadn't fully understood before, that her father's training had prepared her not just to shoot accurately, but to compete at the highest levels under pressure. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Tom's voice was excited as he explained that word of her performance was already spreading through the competitive shooting community. Several major competitions were interested in having her participate, and a couple of equipment manufacturers had expressed interest in sponsorship opportunities. "Sarah, what you did today was remarkable," Tom said, "but I think it's just the beginning. With your natural ability and your father's training, you could compete nationally, maybe even internationally." The possibilities Tom was describing sounded both exciting and overwhelming. Sarah had entered the competition hoping to win enough money to catch up on her bills and maybe honor her father's memory. She hadn't considered that exceptional performance might open doors to opportunities she had never imagined. After hanging up the phone, Sarah walked to her father's old desk and pulled out a worn photo album. The pictures inside showed Roberto in his military uniform, young and confident, holding various rifles and standing with other soldiers. There were also civilian photos of him teaching Sarah to shoot, patient and focused as he guided her through the fundamentals that had served her so well. One photo particularly caught her attention. Roberto standing beside a military shooting trophy, his arm around a young soldier who was holding a rifle remarkably similar to the one Sarah had used that day. The inscription on the back read, "Training the Next Generation of Precision Marksmen, Fort Benning, 2010. Sarah realized that her father had been doing exactly the same thing with her that he had done with countless military personnel, passing on knowledge, skills and discipline that could make the difference between success and failure in critical moments. The competition had been her graduation exercise from a course of instruction that had lasted most of her life. The envelope of prize money sat unopened on the table, but Sarah was already thinking beyond the immediate financial relief it would provide. Tom's phone call had planted seeds of possibility that were beginning to take root in her imagination. She had always assumed that her father's death marked the end of his influence on her life, but today had proven exactly the opposite. Roberto's training and values were now part of who she was, and they would continue to guide her regardless of what path she chose to follow. The emotional weight of the day was finally catching up with Sarah. She had been running on adrenaline and determination for hours, but now in the quiet of her kitchen, she felt the full impact of what had occurred. She had not only won a major competition, but had vindicated her father's teaching methods and proven that dedication and proper instruction could overcome equipment disadvantages. More importantly, she had discovered capabilities within herself that she hadn't known existed. The confidence required to compete against experienced marksmen, the mental toughness needed to perform under pressure, the technical skills necessary to read complex environmental conditions. All of these had emerged when she needed them most. Sarah opened the envelope and counted the prize money carefully. $15,000 would allow her to quit the exhausting double shifts at the diner and focus on other opportunities. It would pay off her debts, fix her truck, and provide the security she hadn't felt since her father's death. But as she sat surrounded by the documentation of her success, Sarah understood that the real prize wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that Roberto Martinez had been an exceptional teacher who had prepared his daughter for challenges she couldn't have anticipated. His legacy lived on not just in her memories but in her abilities and achievements. The shooting community had accepted her not as a curiosity or an amateur, but as a serious competitor worthy of respect. The dismissive laughter and condescending comments of the morning had been replaced by genuine admiration and offers of friendship from people who understood the difficulty of what she had accomplished. As evening approached, Sarah made herself a simple dinner, and reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a single day. That morning, she had been a struggling waitress with an old rifle and fading memories of her father's instruction. Tonight, she was a record-holding competitive marksman with opportunities and possibilities stretching before her. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, of course. It had been building through years of patient instruction, countless hours of practice, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge and skill that only came from dedicated study of the shooting disciplines. Today had simply been the moment when all of that preparation came together, under the pressure of real competition. Sarah realized that her father had known this day might come. Roberto had trained her not just for weekend shooting sessions in the hills, but for moments when her skills would be tested against the best competition available. He had prepared her to represent both herself and his teaching methods with honor and distinction. The phone rang again, and this time it was Jennifer Chen calling to congratulate her and ask if she would be interested in partnering for some upcoming team competitions. The conversation was friendly and respectful, a dramatic change from the skeptical reception Sarah had received that morning. 6 months after the competition that changed her life, Sarah stood at the edge of the same hills where her father had built his private shooting range. The morning sun cast long shadows across the targets Roberto had constructed from scrap materials, and the familiar sound of wind moving through the oak trees brought back countless memories of their weekend practice sessions. The transformation in Sarah's circumstances had been remarkable. The prize money from her record-setting performance had allowed her to leave the diner and focus on competitive shooting full-time. Sponsorship offers from equipment manufacturers had provided her with resources she had never imagined, though she still preferred to compete with her father's rifle whenever possible. More importantly, Sarah had discovered a calling that went beyond personal achievement. Tom had approached her about teaching precision shooting courses at the range, and she had found that she possessed the same patient instructional abilities that had made Roberto such an effective teacher. Her classes were consistently full, with students ranging from curious beginners to experienced hunters wanting to improve their long-range skills. The fundamentals never change, Sarah would tell her students, unconsciously echoing her father's words. Equipment can help, but understanding is what makes the difference between good shooting and exceptional shooting. Her reputation in the competitive shooting world had grown steadily. Sarah had won 3 more major competitions and set records at 2 different ranges. Magazine articles about her success often focused on the equipment disparity story. But Sarah always redirected the conversation toward proper instruction and disciplined practice. The most meaningful development had been the scholarship program Sarah had established in her father's memory. The Roberto Martinez Memorial Fund provided equipment and training opportunities for young shooters who showed potential but lacked financial resources. Sarah funded the program partly from her prize winnings, but equipment manufacturers had begun contributing as well, recognizing the value of supporting grassroots talent development. Marcus had become an unexpected ally and friend. His initial dismissiveness had transformed into genuine respect after he witnessed Sarah's consistent performance across multiple competitions. He often sought her advice on reading wind conditions and had become one of her most effective advocates in promoting her teaching methods. "I spent years trying to buy accuracy with expensive equipment," Marcus admitted during one of their conversations. "Sarah taught me that I should have been investing in education instead." The military shooting community had also embraced Sarah's success. Veterans who had trained under Roberto reached out to share stories about her father's impact on their own shooting development. These connections had led to invitations to teach precision shooting techniques at military bases, carrying on Roberto's tradition of training the next generation of marksmen. Sarah's old rifle had become something of a legend in competitive shooting circles. Equipment manufacturers regularly offered to provide her with the latest precision rifles, but she politely declined most offers. The psychological advantage of competing with superior equipment wasn't worth losing the connection to her father that the old Remington provided. During quiet moments at the range, Sarah would sometimes clean and maintain her father's rifle while thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. The weapon that had once been dismissed as obsolete had proven that craftsmanship and proper setup were more important than manufacturing dates or price tags. The success had brought challenges as well. Media attention sometimes felt intrusive, and the pressure to maintain her performance standards was constant. Sarah had learned to manage these pressures by returning to the fundamental principles Roberto had taught her: patience, discipline, and focus on the process rather than the results. Her teaching methods reflected her father's approach, emphasizing understanding over memorization and practical application over theoretical knowledge. Students learned to read environmental conditions by spending hours observing wind patterns and atmospheric changes, just as Sarah had done during her own instruction. Shooting is about problem solving, Sarah would explain to her advanced classes. Every shot presents a unique set of variables that must be analyzed and addressed. Equipment can provide information, but judgment and experience determine success. The range where Roberto had taught Sarah had become a pilgrimage site for serious precision shooting enthusiasts. Sarah had preserved the targets and shooting positions exactly as her father had constructed them, creating an informal memorial to his teaching methods and philosophy. On the second anniversary of Roberto's death, Sarah organized a memorial competition at the range. Competitors from across the country participated, including many who had been inspired by her story. The event raised money for the scholarship fund while celebrating the enduring impact of excellent instruction on shooting sports. During the memorial ceremony, Frank, the range safety officer who had officiated at Sarah's breakthrough competition, spoke about the ripple effects of great teaching. Roberto Martinez trained his daughter to be not just an exceptional marksman, but an exceptional teacher. His influence continues to spread through everyone Sarah instructs. Sarah's success had also brought recognition to the broader principle that proper instruction could overcome equipment limitations. Shooting schools across the country had begun emphasizing fundamental skills, development over equipment acquisition. Partly inspired by her example, the scholarship program had awarded its first grants to 3 promising young shooters who reminded Sarah of herself 2 years earlier, dedicated students with natural ability but limited resources. Watching them develop under proper instruction brought Sarah the same satisfaction she imagined Roberto had felt while teaching her. As competitive seasons passed, Sarah's achievements continued to accumulate, but she never lost sight of the source of her success. Every technique she used, every principle she applied, every method she taught could be traced directly back to those weekend sessions in the hills with her patient, knowledgeable father. The shooting community had initially been surprised by Sarah's emergence from obscurity, but now her presence at major competitions was expected and welcomed. Her consistent performance and generous sharing of knowledge had earned respect that went beyond her record-setting accuracy. Standing in the hills where her journey had begun, Sarah reflected on how Roberto's influence had multiplied far beyond what either of them could have anticipated. His dedication to teaching one student correctly had created ripples that continued to spread through the precision shooting community. The old Remington 700 rested in its case beside her, still capable of the same precision that had shocked observers at that first competition. Sarah had learned to see the rifle not as an outdated piece of equipment, but as a tangible connection to the principles and knowledge that had shaped her into the marksman she had become. As she prepared to leave the range that had been the foundation of her education, Sarah smiled at the thought that Roberto's legacy was secure. His teaching methods lived on in her instruction, his values guided her decisions, and his memory inspired everyone who heard their story. The young woman who had once been mocked for her shaky hands and secondhand rifle had become living proof that great teaching could overcome any disadvantage. Roberto Martinez had trained his daughter not just to shoot accurately, but to carry forward a tradition of excellence that would influence generations of marksmen to come. Sarah loaded her father's rifle case into her truck and drove away from the hills. Knowing she would return again soon, there were more students to teach, more competitions to enter, and more opportunities to honor the memory of the decorated marksman who had invested everything in preparing his daughter for a moment neither of them had seen coming.